please sign in on the iClicker. If your app is not working well, I encourage you to use the browser version to sign in. I think it might be a little bit more reliable. Okay. Okay. Everyone in from the waiting room. All right. Please sign into the attendance. Number 1. Number 2, if you haven't already, please rename yourself last name, comma, first. And that will help me with the recitation from class today. Okay. All right, let's start. Any questions on your mind from last class? Just raise your hand, please. Okay. People are still coming in. Try to be in the waiting room by 10:30, so I have to keep clicking admit. I don't like having to keep people out. Again, so people still coming in. Please just be here at 10:30 sharp. I don't want to have to do this every class. I mentioned last class, if you have Wi-Fi issues, consider using the phone number. The phone number is easier and it will not drop. Second, I shared with you last week the folder for the class notes. I'm not going to do this again, but the link is in your syllabus. And you can click this link, and you'll see there's a link for class 2. And that's what I'll put the class notes for today. Okay. I know you have a short break, only 15 minutes between property class and this one. Same, I'm in property class right before this, so I have just enough time to run to the bathroom, throw some food in my mouth. That's about all I have time for. So I understand, but we have to move as quickly as we can to get started. Okay, let me give a little bit of a recap, and then we'll move on to new material. I appreciate that everyone put those little minute papers in. I think those are very useful. I read all of them. It helps me to see what you're taking away from the cases, and that lets me know what I perhaps need to clarify. I think most people understood Marbury well enough. They understood the technical aspects that the Supreme Court says Congress cannot expand the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. I think almost everyone got that one. A lot of you also got the sort of political background, right? The dynamics was going on behind the scenes, where Jefferson did not even send a lawyer. He thought so little of the court. He didn't even want to respect by giving an argument. Another person wrote that Marshall was a snake. Okay. One person was perplexed why Hamilton called the judiciary the least dangerous branch, right? Keep in mind the Federalist Papers were trying to sell the Constitution. And in many regards, Hamilton was trying to downplay concerns. He's like, oh, it's not so dangerous. But it turned out to be quite dangerous. One person I think was really paying attention wrote, I'll just read the quote, "You really enjoy Hamilton." True. "Marshall's overrated." True. "Courts lack jurisdiction to issue writ of mandamus into original jurisdiction." True. So check. That one got it. And I'll be playing a Hamilton clip in a minute. I promise it's relevant. Questions before we get started? All right. We're going to begin our discussion today of what we call the doctrine of enumerated powers. Okay, enumerated powers. What the hell is enumerated powers? When we talk about the states, we see that the states have what's called a police power, right? Do you learn about this in torts? Just shake your heads, yes. Police powers, that's not familiar? Okay, good. The police power is the authority of the states to regulate the health, the safety, the welfare, and the morals of the people, right? So all these lovely quarantine laws we have now, right? All these laws requiring us to stay in our houses and wear masks and all these other sorts of things, right? What gives the states the power to enact these laws? It's the police power. Where does this police power come from? Well, I could write a book on that question, but I'll give you a short answer. In any society, power belongs somewhere. Before 1776, where did the power belong? With the English government. Did it belong to the king, maybe parliament? We can argue about this. But the power of governance belonged to the English government. What happened after 1776? Well, we had independence. We absolved all legal ties with the government. But the power did not disappear, right? The power didn't just vanish and go into thin air. The power transferred, if you will, from the English government to the new American governments. I said governments, plural. There wasn't just one. There were 13 colonies that became 13 states. And whatever police power existed before 76 went to the states. And the states had all this authority to regulate their people. But they wouldn't keep all this power. In 1787 and 1788, the states began to ratify the Constitution. Now, what does it mean for a state to ratify the Constitution? Follow me here. The states said, we have all this power, but we want to give some of this power up to this new central government. The states gave up some powers to the federal government in exchange for joining this union. In other words, if you want to join this grand new country, there's a price to pay. You have to give up some of your power, right? We can't have these all-powerful states in whatever they want in this new national government. So when the states entered this union, they surrendered some of their power, right? The states gave up some of their police power to the central government. Now, the states kept most of their power. The overwhelming majority of the power they kept. Right? There's a reason why there's no federal mandate requiring you to wear a mask. It's a state law. Because generally states have power over health and safety. That's not a federal issue, generally. Okay? This area of our class concerns that surrender of power. What powers were given to the federal government by the states? And what power were retained by the states? Right? There were some powers that were given up, and there's some powers that were retained. All right? How do we know what powers were surrendered to the federal government? They're listed or enumerated. The word enumerated, think of like numbered, right? Enumerated. Enumerated means when you list powers, when you list them. The federal government only has those powers that are enumerated, that are listed, that are specified in the Constitution. If a power is not specified in the Constitution, then Congress lacks that power. Okay? So for the rest of the semester, if I ask you, does Congress have the power to do X? Your answer should be yes or no. And how do you answer that question? You look in the Constitution and you see, does this law that Congress enacted fit, right? Fit within a power enumerated. I'm seeing someone says they can't join. There's no password. I'm not seeing one in the waiting room now, so they can't just try the phone number. Okay. We ask, is this law within a power? Okay, now where in the Constitution are Congress's powers listed or enumerated? They're listed in Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8. Article 1, Section 8 lists a lot of powers that Congress has. Okay? Some of these powers are pretty boring, although one actually is quite relevant. I always use this example. No one's ever cared about it, but it's relevant now. One of the powers of the federal government is to establish postal roads. No one's ever cared about the postal clause until now, but welcome to our world. Right? So Congress has the power to regulate the postal roads. Why? Well, it made sense in this brand new country that you'd have a uniform system of transferring letters and packages and different documents, right? There was no telephones, there's no email, so if you want to send a document from A to B, you got to use some sort of postal system, right? Congress also has the power to declare war. That makes sense, right? War is a big deal, and we don't want individual states going to war, right? That would be very disruptive. Let the central government decide when we should have war, not the states. So there's some powers that are thought best held by the federal government. Perhaps the most important power for our class is Article 1, Section 8, Clause number 3, the Commerce Clause. If you click the link, the class note link I sent you guys a moment ago, you'll see it. I've highlighted it on the screen. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. We'll spend, 5 weeks on this provision, this single sentence, and actually only a part of it. Okay? Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3. It reads, the Congress shall have power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states and with the Indian tribes. We will not be talking about commerce with foreign nations. We will not be talking about commerce with the Indian tribes, although it's a fascinating area of law. All we'll be talking about in this case is Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce among the several states. Right? Congress shall have power to regulate commerce among the several states. We're going to spend a lot of time on this one. What does it mean to regulate? What does commerce mean? What does among mean? These are not self-evident questions. Okay? But then we get all the way down to the bottom of Article 1, Section 8. And we have probably the most important provision of the Constitution, maybe top 10. It's called the Necessary and Proper Clause. Okay, the Necessary and Proper Clause. And I think the easiest way to illustrate the Necessary and Proper Clause is with an example. I'll read a few in a minute. The Constitution lists about 18 powers that Congress has. Right? I mean, that's not a huge number, but it's a decent sized number. But the framers, I think, recognized that it wasn't possible to spell out with precision everything the government could do. So I'll give you an easy example. Right? Congress has the power to regulate the postal roads. Okay. Does the Constitution give Congress the power to buy horses, to buy mail trucks, to hire letter carriers? Well, no, the Constitution says nothing about these other things, just says you can have postal roads. But I think most people would agree that to have a postal system, you need horses, right? How are you going to move the packages, right? You need trucks, wagons. You need to hire letter carriers. But Josh, nothing in the Constitution says you can do this. Well, the Necessary and Proper Clause says maybe you can. So let's read it. It's again on that same document on page 1. I'm highlighting it. It says, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. Okay, don't worry about the rest of it. Okay, I'll just end it there, because you don't need the rest of it. The Congress shall have power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying to execution the foregoing powers. Okay, so let's break this down one line at a time. They shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper. What does that mean? What's necessary mean? What's proper mean? What does it mean to carry into execution? I mean, you're killing someone, you're executing them? And what are these foregoing powers? Well, let's start at the end. This provision, the necessary and proper clause, appears at the end of Article 1, Section 8. It's the last clause, Clause 18. When the Constitution says foregoing powers, what are they referring to? Clauses 1 through 17. Right? Like the postal roads, right? The Commerce Clause. The reference to Article 1, Section 8, Clause 18 refers to everything that comes before it in Article 1, Section 8. What this clause gives Congress the power to do is enact laws to help execute, help bring into force the other provisions. So if they want to establish a postal system and they want to buy horses, you can do that. That's necessary. If you want to buy wagons, that's necessary. If you want to, hire letter carriers, that's necessary. Is it a proper exercise of federal power to buy horses? Sure it is. Okay. What you need to understand, and what frankly most law students and many law professors don't understand, is a necessary and proper clause is a separate power. Right? It works in conjunction with the others, but it stands by itself. So whenever I ask you, John Doe, does Congress have the power to enact this law? You're probably going to give me one or maybe two answers. You'll probably say, yeah, the Commerce Clause and the necessary and proper clause. It's almost always going to be both of them. So I'll give you a free tip for the exam. If you ever just don't know and you're really not sure, always say Commerce and necessary and proper clause. You're probably right. I mean, I'm not telling you anything surprising. It's not like giving any secrets away. It's pretty straightforward. But on any question, you're saying, what gives Congress the power to do something? It's almost always going to be Commerce Clause and or necessary and proper clause. You're probably right one of the two. It's almost always necessary and proper clause. So you can just guess from there. Okay. Okay. This background I just read for you is largely taken from the chapter on McCulloch v. Maryland. So if what I said didn't make sense, you can go back and rewatch that shortened video. But hopefully it will. All right. Questions? Put up your blue hands, please, if you have any. No? Okie doke. All right. I'm going to play a clip from Hamilton. It's good. But this gives you the background of the Bank of the United States controversy. And let me just set it up. If you haven't seen it on Disney Plus, or if you have a friend as a password, just maybe borrow it for a day. It's very good. Share screen. Google Chrome. All right. So the setup of the scene is you have a cabinet meeting, right? You have a cabinet meeting, President Washington's cabinet, and you have on the one hand Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and you have on the other hand Alexander Hamilton. Now, I'm sorry, my friends on YouTube, I'm putting you on mute. The reason why is that in the past when I play clips from Hamilton, I get a very nice copyright request and they take down my lecture. So you are on mute. Sorry. I'll bring. The reason why I love playing that clip for you all is it distills the entire controversy of the bank in such an enjoyable way. Um, in the earliest days of the Republic, uh, we had a lot of debt. What else is new, right? We had acquired a lot of debt from fighting the war, and the states had not been contributing to the effort. In many cases, Washington's soldiers were underarmed, they didn't have clothes, they didn't have food. It was a very bad situation. And Hamilton comes up with this idea that would create a national bank. Now, this is not like the Federal Reserve, right? This was actually a bank where private people would invest in this entity and would allow the government to have a lot of capital. This bank was a popular idea in the northern states, which primarily had imports. They would import goods and they would engage in trade. This plan was not popular in the South, which was primarily agricultural, slave-based economies. They didn't want to have the centralization of power. So you had this huge divide over the bank. But beyond the policy questions was the constitutional question. Did Congress have the power to create or charter this national bank? This was an open question, and there was a huge debate within the government. So let me walk you through some of the highlights. the Hamilton clip referenced some of them. In Congress, you have James Madison. Again, Madison is considered one of the fathers of the Constitution. He helped write the damn thing. Madison argued that this federal bank was unconstitutional. Why? He said that the bank was not necessary, that Congress didn't need to establish a bank. Okay. Then we go to the White House. Congress approves the bill, and President Washington asks his cabinet, his advisors, say, what do you think? Should I sign this bill into law? You have Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, who largely agreed with Madison, maybe even a little bit stricter. And he basically said, necessary means absolutely necessary, right? Congress can only enact those laws that they really need to enact. There was no need to have a bank. Congress could collect taxes without a bank. Congress could borrow money without a bank. Congress could regulate commerce without a bank. They didn't need this bank. Then you get to Hamilton. Hamilton had the idea for the bank, and he put together an opinion saying the bank was valid. And he offered a very broad definition of what necessary means. And he gave a couple words. I'll read them to you. There are 5 words. Needful, requisite, incidental, useful, conducive. The most important word there is useful. The argument is this: if it is useful for Congress to charter a bank to collect taxes or borrow money, then Congress has the power to charter the bank. Let me say that again. If Congress finds it useful to charter a bank to do something else they can do, like collecting taxes, then they have that power. Hamilton adopted a very broad conception of what necessary means. It doesn't mean strictly necessary or absolutely necessary. It means useful. Washington signed the bill into law. He chartered the first bank. He probably agreed with Hamilton, or maybe thought it was a close call. We don't really know for sure. And the first bank would remain in business for nearly 2 decades. And in 1816, America launched its second national bank. And who signed into law? President James Madison. Yes, the same James Madison who argued it was unconstitutional when he was a member of Congress, now backed the bank as president. Did he change his mind? It's unclear. We don't really know. But I think Madison may have thought that the members of Congress be deferred to in this case. All right, that history brings us to the current case in 1818. Okay, who am I up to? Who was last class? Just raise your hand, please, if you were last. I don't remember. I never remember. Someone? Right. Yes, Alexandra, go ahead. You want to give me the facts, please, in McCulloch v. Maryland?
I was last time, but I can still give you the facts.
Oh, you're nice. So you're throwing Vanessa under the bus. I see. Okay, I'm kidding. Thank you, though. Vanessa, you here?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, can you give us the facts, please, McCulloch v. Maryland?
Yes. So in 1816, Congress chartered the second bank of the United States. And in 1818, Maryland, they had a branch in Maryland, and in 1818, the Maryland General Assembly imposed a tax on the branch.
Good.
And the bank's cashier, which was McCulloch, refused to tax, and so Maryland sued to recover the money.
Okay, so let me ask you a question, Vanessa. Is there any problem with a state imposing a tax on a federal bank? Is there anything problematic about that? Forget the Commerce Clause for a minute. Just in general, what's the problem when a state imposes a tax on a federal bank?
I mean, federal is higher power, so maybe states would be stepping on the toes of federal government.
Well, Vanessa, let me ask the question a little differently. Did Maryland impose this tax as a way to raise revenue? Was that their intent, do you think?
No.
Why do you think Maryland imposed this tax, Vanessa?
I'm not sure. I remember seeing that they like tried to make it seem like they were imposing it generally, but it really only affected the federal bank that was in.
You're on the right track. Samuel, G, are you here? Samuel?
Yes, sir. I'm here.
Samuel, why do you think Maryland imposed this tax? Was this just a way of raising revenue?
I don't believe so, but like Vanessa said, I'm still looking through my notes. I'm not exactly sure.
Why do you think, did Maryland favor the bank or did Maryland oppose the bank? It's on your notes. Look up here for a second. I'm right here.
Yes,
Camera.
sir.
Oh, look at the camera at least. Samuel,
No problem.
did Maryland support the bank or did Maryland oppose the bank?
They're in the north, but
Oh, but they're not.
I mean,
Maryland is actually considered a southern state. I know that's not what you think, but Maryland was a huge agricultural state. It was very much pro-slavery. They did not secede, although they still had slavery during the Civil War. So Maryland is not as you think. So let me ask the question again. Do you think Maryland favored the bank or opposed the bank?
opposed it.
So why do you think they imposed this tax? What do you think they were trying to do?
Well, as you were talking about, power of the tax is power to destroy. So
Yes. The power to tax is the power to destroy. Marshall did not make that up, but it was a very good line he used. How would this tax, Samuel, have destroyed the bank?
well, if the bank, if you're taxing it, trying to hit it in the weak spot, I mean, the U.S. already has debt, so you're trying to make it even worse.
Yeah, okay, very good. Thank you, Samuel. This was a tax designed to destroy the bank. We can be very candid about this, right? Virtually every transaction that the bank engaged in had to be taxed. And the federal government didn't have this money. They weren't going to pay this. So then we get to the question, can a state tax the bank as a way to destroy it? The short answer is no, right? The federal government cannot be destroyed by a state. We have in the Constitution what's called the Supremacy Clause, right, which is probably the most important aspect of the Constitution, right? The Supremacy Clause. The Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution shall be the supreme law of the land. Supreme law of the land. So any state law that conflicts with the federal law, the state law is void. Again, if a state law conflicts with the federal law, the state law has no effect. So Congress does not have to worry about the states. If a state wants to try to shut the federal bank down, they can't. They can't. Okay? But that doesn't resolve the issue, right? If the federal bank is valid, then Maryland can enact their tax. But the question is that, Stuart, you here?
I'm here.
So Stuart,
Do you hear me?
yeah, so Stuart, here's your question. If the bank is valid, then Maryland can enact the tax. Do we agree on that much?
Mhm.
But what does Marshall have to decide in this case? What's the question Marshall has to decide to resolve this case?
Whether the bank is valid under the enumerated powers.
Perfect answer. Just say it one more time, right? What's the issue Marshall has to resolve in this case?
Whether the bank is valid under the enumerated powers
Yeah.
given by the Constitution.
Very good. Thank you, Stuart. The question presented in this case is the bank valid? Right? Does Congress have the power to enact this law? If Congress has the power to create the bank, then Maryland loses because a state cannot destroy a federal bank. If Congress does not have the power to create the bank, then this case goes away, right? You can't tax you can't tax a bank that doesn't exist. Maryland's law is, fine. All right, so let's do a poll question. Get your devices ready. I'll paste it into the class notes right over here. So here's your question. Let me start the thing. I'll start reading it. Which enumerated power in Article 1, Section 8 did Chief Justice Marshall rely on to uphold the constitutionality of the Bank of the United States? A, Commerce Clause. B, taxing power. C, necessary and proper clause. D, all the above. Go ahead, and I'll give you about 30 seconds. Yeah, I don't want these questions to drag on forever. I don't like to rush people, but we have very little time in this class, so little time. All right, another 20 seconds. Everyone, please get your answers in. Okay, 5 more seconds. All right, thank God, everyone. All right, let's see what we got for results. Okay, we got, I think, maybe 2 people put Commerce Clause, maybe 1 person put taxing power. About 70% of you put necessary and proper clause, and about 30% of you put all the above. Okay, so I think C and you guys see the results, right, in your phone? Do the results pop up? Okay, good. I think C and D seem to be the most popular choices for today. Who's next? Husna, are you here? Husna? Nope. Benjamin, you here, Benjamin?
Yes, sir.
Okay, Benjamin. What did you put here, sir?
Necessary and proper.
Okay, walk me through your thinking, please.
Well, the discussion in the case, the necessary and proper clause was the primary focus of it, and they were defining what necessary was, what proper was, and the different, really trying to get to the core of how the government can create this bank, even though there's nothing in the enumerated powers saying that they can do just that, make a bank.
Okay. I think Lewis, Lewis, are you next on the list? Are you here, Lewis?
Yes, sir.
What'd you put here, Lewis?
I put necessary and proper clause as well.
Okay, so let's talk about the necessary and proper clause for a minute, Lewis. Let me go on the class notes. I'll go down to it. It says, Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. What are the foregoing powers in this case that Congress is carrying into execution?
So those would be the enumerated powers that were listed above.
Right, and which ones are those? Just to help me out here.
2 would be, one of them would be the taxing one, and then the other would be a commerce clause.
Ah. So Congress is using its necessary and proper powers to carry into execution its commerce powers and its taxing powers. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, sir.
So why is the answer not D, all the above?
I guess it wouldn't be the taxing power here because they weren't allowing Maryland to tax, or the federal bank wasn't trying to tax.
No. It's Congress's power to tax, not Maryland's power to tax.
So since Maryland was the one taxing, the taxing power would not be
No.
used.
I think you got it right, Lewis, the first time, right? When we say that Congress can enact the bank to execute its taxing power, it's Congress's power. So let's say that Congress wants to collect taxes from people, and rather than keeping all the money in the capital, they keep the money in local branches throughout the country, right? Wouldn't having these local branches make it easier to collect taxes?
Yes, that was the point, I think, in the bank.
So why is the answer not all the above? Isn't it commerce and taxing power and necessary and proper kind of all thrown together?
So I just from the process of elimination, I'd say I guess it's not the commerce power then.
Oh, I don't know, Louis. What do you think? Let's go on to is that Christopher next. Christopher, you here?
Yeah,
Was it here? C or D? What do you think?
I picked the necessary and proper too.
Yeah, but why is it not? Why is it not all the above? Don't you need the commerce clause as a foregoing power? Don't you need the taxing power as a foregoing power?
I suppose so.
Well, C or D? Well, you got to pick one. I'm giving you a choice.
I guess taxing power could be considered necessary and proper too. So like, could it lump together?
All right, well, Chris, let me ask you a question. Is the federal bank a regulation of interstate commerce? Is the bank itself regulating interstate commerce?
No, it's not.
Chris, is the federal bank imposing and laying taxes on people?
No.
No.
Yeah.
So what's the answer here?
So it's just C then.
It's C.
Okay.
C is the right answer. I'm sorry to put you through the paces, but I want to make this point painfully clear for everyone. I know about a third of you put D, and I want to explain why D is not the right answer. There's a link between the necessary and proper clause and the commerce clause, and there's a link between the necessary and proper clause and the taxing power, right? Congress can enact the bank to make it easier to regulate commerce. Congress can enact the bank to make it easier to collect taxes. But the bank bill itself is not a regulation of interstate commerce. The bank bill itself is not an exercise of taxing power. The only power that authorizes the bank is the necessary and proper clause standing by itself. Now, I'm going to tell you, most people don't get this concept. Most lawyers, most students, and many professors. In almost any case you read that involves federal power, the answer is necessary and proper. I think I said that to you earlier, right? It might be commerce clause, but it's almost always necessary and proper. The difficulty is the courts don't always acknowledge what they're doing. The courts will not always explain that they're relying on the necessary and proper clause. They'll say, oh, we're relying on the commerce clause. We're relying on the taxing power. Indirectly. But the necessary and proper clause is the basis for almost every federal law you read. So this semester, again, if you have a question, when I ask you, what's the authority for some sort of law? It might be commerce clause, but it's almost certainly going to be necessary and proper clause. It might be both, right? There might be some cases where it's both commerce and necessary and proper, right? It might be A and C in certain cases. But necessary and proper is always sort of hiding in the background. It's always doing work, even though the courts don't acknowledge it. Good. Bridget asks, and by the way, just if you have a question, I'm free if you raise your hand, but I'll read it quickly. Is this related to the discussion on 121 regarding the inverse corporation relationship? I don't remember what page 121 is. I'll check that after class. I don't have time to check the page right now, but I don't think that's. Yeah, I don't think that's relevant right now. Okay. All right. Questions on that aspect. All right. I want to try to see how this works. Word cloud. So your next question is, I want a one-word answer. I'll see how this works. What does necessary mean? Just enter one word. What does necessary mean? I want to see if this word cloud thing actually works. I have no idea if this is going to work, but I'll try it. I'll give you another 10 seconds. Just one word. You guys text pretty fast. We'll see if this actually works. All right. There we go, just about 60. All right, let's see how that works, okay? Stop. Okay. Word cloud. Do you guys see the word cloud? Do you see that? No? Ugh, damn, oh, I see it. All right. Well, I'll give you the breakdown. 20% of you put needed, 30% put useful, 5% put required, 2% put vital, essential, important, strictly necessary. Okay? But the most common answer, I think, is the word that the court ultimately uses, which is useful. Right? In McCulloch v. Maryland, Chief Justice Marshall reads the necessary and proper clause in almost the exact same way that Hamilton read the necessary and proper clause. He tweaks a little bit, and I'll get to that tweak in a minute. But Marshall's opinion in McCulloch is basically a plagiarism of Hamilton. He doesn't cite him, but he basically plagiarizes. In the same way that Marshall plagiarized Hamilton, right, in Marbury. Marbury was basically a copy of Federal 78. Once again, John Marshall basically copies Hamilton opinion to Washington. Now, I don't want to downplay Marshall too much. I think he was a brilliant guy. I think he's head overrated, right? But what Marshall says is when we discuss the necessary and proper clause, we have to give Congress some flexibility. That they can enact laws that are useful to carry into execution their other powers. Marshall describes the bank as a, quote, convenient, useful, essential instrument in the prosecution of Congress's fiscal operations. Marshall says the bank is an appropriate mode of executing the powers of the government. Marshall rejects Jefferson. He says the bank does not need to be an absolute physical necessity. It's enough that it's useful. Now, Marshall adds a word to the list. If you remember, Hamilton said needful, requisite, useful, or conducive. Right, those are 4 words. Needful, requisite, useful, conducive. Marshall uses the same 4 adjectives, but adds a 5th adjective that Hamilton did not add. Marshall adds convenient. Ooh. You see the difference between useful and convenient, right? Useful as well, it's actually serving a use. Convenient as well, makes things easier, but whatever, don't really need it. By adding that 5th element, Marshall watered down Hamilton's standard. He made it easier to apply. Marshall actually would later write these letters. This is insane. He wrote these anonymous op-eds in newspapers where he defended McCulloch. And he said, no, don't make such a big deal about a convenient. It's not that big of a deal. He kind of tried to walk himself back. So we don't really even know what he meant. He kind of goes back and forth. But the important point here is that the Hamiltonian vision of necessary and proper was adopted. And Marshall said that Congress had the power to charter the bank. And because Congress had the power to charter the bank was constitutional. And because the bank was constitutional, Maryland's tax was void. Okay? Now, McCulloch has some language that's very famous. I want to just read some of this language. I'll get to a second, lady, I promise. Marshall has some language that's very famous. And he gives this test. And I'll copy it for you into the chat so you can, again, I don't like screen sharing. I think it's an awful thing. I hate it. So I try and do as little as possible. But here's this phrase used, and let me read it to you. He says, let the end be legitimate. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution, and all means which are appropriate, which are plainly adapted to that end, which are not prohibited, but consist with the letter and spirit of the Constitution, are constitutional. What the heck is going on there? In constitutional law, we'll discuss this concept of means ends scrutiny. Means ends scrutiny. Okay, what the hell is that, Josh, right? Means ends scrutiny is a way of balancing what are you trying to achieve and what are you doing to get there, right? What are you trying to achieve and what are you doing to get there? What are the means? What are you actually doing? What are the ends? What are you trying to achieve? So Marshall says, let the end be legitimate. Okay. Is establishing a bank legitimate? Yeah. Let it be within the scope of the Constitution. Does Congress have the power to charter the bank? Yeah. Okay. What are the means that they're using? Well, they're using their necessary and proper powers to help, you know, reduce debt and to centralize fiscal operations. Is having that bank plainly adapted to achieving those financial ends? Yeah. Is there anything prohibiting it? No. Is it consistent with the letter and spirit of the Constitution? Yeah. George Washington signed off. What's so bad about that? Therefore, it's constitutional. Right? You're asking, can Congress use its necessary and proper powers as a means to establish a bank to achieve fiscal soundness, fiscal health? The answer is yes. Congress is fine, and this law is permissible. This is a very famous test that we'll come back to over and over again, and other judges will quote it. Marshall also writes that the Constitution doesn't need to be specific on every question. It's not a legal code. And he says our Constitution is intended to endure for the ages to come, to be adapted to the various crises of human affairs. What does that mean? No, it doesn't mean that judges can rewrite the Constitution. That's not what it means. It means that the Constitution speaks in general terms, and it's not meant to address every specific issue. So McCulloch is probably the most important Supreme Court case ever. I mean, it's not Marbury. We could live without Marbury. We'd be just fine without Marbury. But without McCulloch, our country would have ended very quickly. If the states were allowed to punish a federal institution, then the states could just destroy the federal government. It would be over. So if McCulloch had come out the other way, I don't know that the country could have survived very long, especially as we veered towards a civil war. So, you know, Marbury, whatever, big deal, judicial review, we could live without that. But without McCulloch, I think our country would have ended pretty quickly. Okay. Lainey was patiently waiting. I'm sorry to put you on hold for so long.
You were just trying to make me forget my question.
I'm sorry.
You said that Hamiltonian something was adopted in this case. Was it the Hamiltonian opinion, the Hamiltonian
Yes.
view?
Yeah, Hamilton's view of necessary and proper.
Thank you.
Yep, my pleasure. Other questions? All right. Other questions? And again, I encourage you, if you haven't, just watch the videos on these cases. They're short. They're very good. I mean, I made them, but you know, they're good. They're selling very well. It's not just Josh saying this, but I think they're especially helpful with our reduced class time. They'll fill in some of the gaps in your notes. Any other questions? Okay, let us move on to the next case. Gibbons v. Ogden. Let me try another poll question. Okay. All right, so here's your poll question. Short answer. One word. What does commerce mean? Just one word. What does commerce mean? Give me one word. All right. Another 15 seconds. Okay, I like these short questions because they're very quick. Everyone seems to do them quickly. Okay, 5 more seconds. Very good. I got 60. Okay. That's what we got. All right, so we got intercourse in first place, trade in second place, and the other ones are not correct. But I like the first two. All right. Who am I up to? Is that Dina? You here? You here,
Yes.
Dina? Thanks, Dina. What'd you put here?
I put intercourse.
Okay. Now, I know that sounds like a dirty word, but in this context, what does intercourse mean?
It's referring to the commercial intercourse between nations and,
Try to define it without using the word.
I guess like trade and communications.
Well, isn't that the same as trade? Is intercourse same thing as trade?
No.
No. Let's see who's next on the list. Harrison, what'd you put here?
I put the trade.
Ah, so what's the difference between trade and intercourse, Harrison?
I think when you're getting into intercourse is describing a certain kind of trade between the states in this case, and trade has a pretty broad term overall that could mean a number of things. But
Is riding a boat a trading? You trading something when you ride a boat?
navigation is what
Is,
we're
na-
discussing.
is navigation trade?
It's necessary for trade.
Stop.
In this case.
Stop with necessary. I'm just asking about commerce here. You're being clever, which I always appreciate. I like law students when they're clever. But let's just stick to the question. Is trade and intercourse synonymous? Do they have the same meaning?
No.
All right, let's see who's next. Is that Morgan? You here, Morgan?
I'm here.
So what's the difference between trade and intercourse? Are these the same thing?
No, I think intercourse has to deal with like interacting with two different.
Might I say maybe intercourse might mean interaction maybe? Is that what you said?
Interaction.
So exchange maybe?
Yeah.
So which is broader, Morgan? I'm sorry?
So exchange is kind of like trade. So I guess it kind of.
Well, but which is broader, Morgan? Intercourse or trade? Which has a bigger range of activities?
Intercourse.
Why?
Because there's just, I feel like, I don't know.
Well. I think I think you're really close. What define trade for me, just in your own your own general language. What does trade mean?
Giving something to someone. in
Right.
exchange.
I give you money, you give me a widget, right? That's a trade. With intercourse, does there have to be an exchange of money or widgets?
No.
Could navigation fall within the category of intercourse?
I think it could.
Could-
'Cause you're
Yeah. So
going from one place to
yeah,
another.
very good, Morgan. So can navigation fall within the category of trade?
Yes, because in order to trade stuff,
No. But assuming there's no money, right? I'm just driving a boat from New York to New Jersey. Is that trade?
you're not trading the boat for anything.
Nope. I'm just driving my boat from New York to New Jersey. Everything's legal in New Jersey, right? That's from Hamilton. Sorry. Is that trade, just driving a boat from New York to New Jersey?
No.
Okay. Is that intercourse when you drive a boat from New York to New Jersey? You're bringing people from one side of the river to the other.
I'd say yes.
Bingo. Very good. Thank you, Morgan. Right. So we have these two concepts. I think the word cloud, if you can see it, which you can, is mostly trade intercourse, right? Depending how you define commerce, we get a very different federal power, right? If we define commerce as simply trade, that is, you're exchanging a widget for money or you're bartering one widget for another widget, then commerce is pretty narrow. But if commerce means intercourse, then we're in a different world, right? Then there's a lot more activity that Congress can regulate. The story of the Marshall Court, if there's a story to be told, is the expansion of federal power. The expansion of federal power. And Marshall did this by broadly construing terms in the Constitution. In McCulloch v. Maryland, he broadly interpreted the word necessary. Right? In McCulloch, he broadly interpreted the word necessary. In our next case, Gibbons v. Ogden, Marshall gave a broad interpretation of the word commerce. Now, I think Gibbons was probably correct for the most part. I have some quibbles, but this one was more or less, I think, probably the right call. In McCulloch, I think he expanded with his language by convenience, which was problematic. But I think Gibbons, for the most part, is probably, I think commerce and intercourse, I think, is a good enough definition for the most part. Okay. Okie doke. We had Morgan. Okay, now Jose, are you here?
I'm gonna mute myself. Yes, sir.
Jose, could you give me the facts, please, in Gibbons v. Ogden?
Yes, sir. So, John Gibbons,
John.
was his name John?
Name was not John.
Alright, okay, so I believe Gibbons had
Thomas Gibbons, just for your notes. Yeah, that's your last name. Okay, so go ahead. I'm sorry, Jose.
No problem. He essentially had like a grant to a monopoly over, moving his boats.
Wait a minute, who had the monopoly here? Is it Gibbons or Ogden?
Am I getting confused? I thought Gibbons, but I'm assuming if you're asking that question, it was Ogden.
Well, that's the wrong answer.
Oh, so it is Gibbons.
No. You shouldn't be asking this question. You should know it. All right. Let me clarify, because I don't want people messing up their notes. Ogden had the monopoly.
Okay.
Okay, go on.
So Ogden had a monopoly granted from the state, and Gibbons was granted a federal permission to travel, or to use steamboats for travel, and Ogden brought suit against Gibbons for an injunction, and then Gibbons claimed that would be a violation of Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce.
Okay, very good. All right. Thank you, Jose. All right, so we have these two guys. We have Gibbons and we have Ogden. Ogden had a monopoly under New York law, and that monopoly allowed him to move boats back and forth between New York and New Jersey. If you've never been to New York and New Jersey, it's basically a river called the Hudson River, right? And on one side is New York, and the other side is New Jersey. Ogden would have steamboats going back and forth between New York and New Jersey. Gibbons shows up and says, aha, I don't care. I'm going to run my own boat from New Jersey. Ogden sued to stop the steamboat business. And he said, look, I have this monopoly. Now, Gibbons said, no, I have a federal license. And in a conflict between a federal license and a state license, the federal license would, I think, prevail. This is a similar issue to McCulloch, right? That the state can't punish the federal institution. Not exactly the same, but in the same ballpark. So the court had to decide, was Gibbons's federal license valid, right? Could Congress regulate travel of boats between New York and New Jersey? And this case called upon Marshall to decide the meaning of the Commerce Clause. Now, this is a rare case that does not involve the necessary and proper clause. Remember I said it's almost always necessary and proper? This is an exception, right? The necessary and proper clause is not relevant to Gibbons. It's one of the few. This case turns entirely on the Commerce Clause, right? And the court has to interpret the Commerce Clause. Now, Ogden, who had the New York monopoly, argues for a very narrow meaning of commerce. He says commerce is traffic, buying, selling, interchanging commodities. Ogden argued that commerce did not include navigation. Therefore, Ogden said the New York law was valid because a federal law was unconstitutional. Congress can't regulate boat traffic. That's not their business. Chief Justice Marshall rejects Ogden's reading of necessary. I'm sorry, wrong case. Chief Justice Marshall rejects Ogden's reading of commerce. He adopts a much broader meaning of commerce. He says, I'll put this in the chat so you can see it. Commerce is undoubtedly traffic, but it is more. It is intercourse. That's the word he uses, intercourse. It describes the commercial intercourse between nations and parts of nations in all its branches, and is regulated by prescribing rules for carrying on that intercourse. Now, Marshall did what I told Dina not to do. He defined intercourse by using the word intercourse, which creates a circular problem, right? He says, commerce is intercourse. That is intercourse, right? It describes intercourse. Well, what the hell is intercourse? This is one of Marshall's greatest, I don't want to say it's a weakness, he did deliberately, but one of my biggest beefs with Marshall is that he would use language in a very broad fashion, quite deliberately, without clarifying it. So the actual holding, I think, is more narrow than what the language suggests, right? The actual holding, I think, is not that big of a deal. A boat going from New York to New Jersey was commerce. I think that was okay. But he has this broad language of it's something more, it's intercourse, it's all intercourse, and what the hell does that mean? So the holdings in Marshall cases are always more narrow than the actual language being used. Okay, everyone get that part of the case? All right, now let's go back to the Commerce Clause. If you go back to the class notes, and I'm going to highlight a word, right? It says, Congress shall have the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Among the several states. This is a strange word. Moses, you here?
Yes.
Moses, help me out here. What does it mean to have commerce among the several states? What does that phrase mean, among?
He defines among as intermingled with.
Intermingled? What a good word. What does intermingled mean?
That all these states are together. They're joined together. They're going to be in relationship together. That these rivers and streams are going to flow into everybody's territory and jurisdiction. So they're all connected.
Okay, so let me ask you a follow-up question, Moses, if I can. If every state is connected by some body of water or by a road, can Congress regulate commerce that's entirely localized? Like, if I'm sitting here in Texas and I sell you a widget, is that commerce that Congress can regulate? Does Marshall go that far?
No, I don't think he'll go that far, although he hedges a little bit towards the end of his opinion.
Good. Tell me what the hedge is. That's good.
So he goes with the policing powers that you talk about. I think is there. I can talk about it, but I can't say it exactly. He said it's like he says we can't. In essence, what he's saying is Congress can't tell states what to do inside their states.
Good.
And yet, what happens inside of your state will also impact what happens to your neighboring state and other states.
Okay,
that's
good.
Therefore, indirectly, Congress can have some influence inside what happens inside your states.
Okay, that's very good. I think you said a few things here. Let me just repeat a few things that he said. The phrase "among" isn't obvious what that means. If we're talking literally about a boat going from New Jersey to New York, that is commerce among the states, right? I don't think anyone would fight that you literally have a boat going from New York to New Jersey, right? What if you have, I don't know, a boat going from the bay in Galveston up to Houston Ship Channel to Houston, right? Is that commerce among the states? Or what if you have, a lake, in the middle of Houston that's not connected to any body of water, and you're inside that lake? Can Congress regulate that? What if you were on a road, you're on I-10, which connects Houston, and then you keep going, you go to New Orleans, right? Is that a place that Congress can regulate? Marshall says that among means intermingled with. And again, intermingle sounds a lot like intercourse. This word inter, which means between, right? Like internet, right? And Marshall says among means more states than one. So when you have commercial activity involving more states than one, Congress can regulate it. That's really broad, isn't it? And I want you just to pause for a minute. And I think Moses said, stuff that happens in one state indirectly, spills over to another state. I like the way he put it. Almost anything you do in Texas will have effect in another state. If we follow Marshall's reasoning to its logical conclusion, virtually everything anyone does has an effect on stuff in another state. See, I'm using this word effect, right? If we take this reasoning seriously, then Congress can regulate just about anything it wants. And in the 1800s and 1900s, the court would sort of move in that direction. And the court would basically say anything Congress can regulate, anything Congress wants to regulate, they can. Why? Because any economic activity in one state will have an effect on economic activity in another state. It's among the several states. And the court would build this on top of the necessary and proper clause. This is where the sort of spillover effect would be existed. So the holding in Gibbons was narrow enough. A boat going from New York to New Jersey is commerce among the several states, intercourse among the states. That's fine. But this definition of among or intermingled with became a basis for expansion of power. Marshall writes, exclusively internal commerce is for the states. That's the word he uses. Exclusively internal commerce. So something's exclusively internal. I'm selling you a widget and that's it. That's only for the states to regulate. But you'll see how quickly the court relies on the necessary and proper clause to expand that authority. Okay. Questions on Gibbons, right? Again, the big points are commerce means intercourse, among means intermingled with, and if you combine those two elements, right, Congress can now regulate intercourse that's intermingled between states, which is a very, very broad power. Okie doke. Questions on Gibbons versus Ogden? Questions on Gibbons v. Ogden? Okay. No? All right. One last point on Gibbons I'd like to mention. Marshall explains that the enumerated powers doctrine does matter. And Marshall says, I'm going to read this quote, it's famous, enumeration presupposes something not enumerated. Again, enumeration presupposes something not enumerated. What does that mean? The fact that Congress listed, these 18 clauses in Article 1, Section 8 means that there's other stuff Congress cannot do. So there are limited powers, but Marshall reads the ones that are there quite broadly. So invariably, in American history, presidents and Congress have tried to squeeze in everything into the Commerce Clause and the Necessary and Proper Clause. They've tried mightily, and they've mostly succeeded. Okay. All right. Questions on... Excuse me. Questions on Gibbons? Okay, let's move on. One more poll question. I'm looking for a number. And here's your question. This section of the Constitution limits the powers of the states. Article 1, Section blank. I'm looking for a number. This section of the Constitution limits the power of the states. Article 1, Section blank. Another 20 seconds. Okay, 5 more seconds. Excuse me. Okay. Let's see what we got. Ooh. Half of you put Article 1, Section 10. About 25% of you put Article 1, Section 8. I don't even know what Article 1, Section 4 is. 7, I think you're guessing. There is no Article 1, Section 18, you guessed. I think you meant Clause 18, that's not right. Section 5. Section 25, I don't know what that is. Okay, well, let's see, who's up next? Erica, are you here?
Yes.
Erica,
Can you hear me?
yeah, what'd you put here, Erica?
I definitely guessed, but I know it's 10 now.
How do you know it's 10?
Because it says no state shall,
Ah.
and it lists limitations.
Very good. Okay, so let me just stick with me, Erica, for a second, right?
Yes.
On the class document, if you scroll down to the bottom of page 2, you'll see Article 1, Section 10, right? You see that, Erica?
I'm pulling it up right now at the very bottom.
Page 2. See where it says Article 1, Section 10?
Yes.
Okay. Just read that text, please.
No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal.
Oh, let me pause you there. Marque and reprisal is my favorite parts of the Constitution. It's basically a license to be a pirate, right? Congress would give these letters to people that says you can go seize a ship at sea and capture its property. A couple years ago, one of my students actually got me a letter of marque. If you actually come to my office, it's hanging on the wall. It says like, Josh Blackman is hereby authorized to seize pirate. It's kind of cool. Anyway. All right, that's good enough, Erica. So thank you. So what's unique about Article 1, Section 10 is it puts limitations on the states. But they're not many. There's only, what's it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6 or 7 things that the states cannot do. We have to recognize that the Constitution, as was originally ratified, primarily limits the powers of the state government. I'm sorry. It primarily limits the power of the federal government not the state governments, right? The states are generally left to their own devices under the original Constitution. And indeed, that proved problematic. And of course, I'm speaking of the issue of slavery. In the original Constitution, the states were basically, I won't say authorized, but the Constitution didn't expressly prohibit slavery. We can argue that perhaps it did, and I think there's some arguments that may have, but we'll put that aside for now. But on its face, there was no obvious reason why the states were prohibited from having slavery. You may ask, but Josh, what about the Bill of Rights? Right, the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, aren't they very important? Well, they were important, but not as important as you might think. Okay, so let me just make this one clear. The answer is Article 1, Section 10. So if you got that one right, good job. Jeffrey, are you here? Jeffrey, you here?
Yes.
Jeffrey, help me out here. Let's just start with the First Amendment. If you look at the documents on page 2, which branch of government does the First Amendment apply to?
The federal government.
How do you know that? You're right, but how do you know that? There's an obvious clue. Starts with the first word in the First Amendment. What's the first word in the First Amendment?
Alright, I'm getting it out.
Yeah, just everyone, just keep these documents open. Just keep a tab open. It'll points because it'll make this class much smoother.
Congress
Congress. Congress what? Keep reading.
shall make no law respecting make no law respecting an establishment of religion or
Okay,
prohibiting the
that-
free exercise.
Okay, that's fine. So the First Amendment says Congress, right? Is a state allowed to establish religion?
It doesn't say.
Doesn't say. Is a state allowed to abridge freedom of speech?
Doesn't say.
Can a state violate the freedom of the press?
Doesn't say.
Doesn't say. Jeffrey, how could that be under our Constitution that the states can do all these awful things? How can that possibly be? How can that
Well,
possibly be the right answer?
The states had already created their own constitutions.
Oh. So you're saying if the states want to, they can violate free speech? If that's in their Constitution, they're allowed to do it?
Technically, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Jeffrey. So we have this weird moment, usually in the second day of class, where it's like, wait a minute. We have this amazing First Amendment that some people want to repeal, right? But we have this amazing First Amendment now that only applies to the federal government. Well, it's not like that anymore. After the Civil War, we ratified the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is understood to put the states under the first 8 amendments. Right? The 14th Amendment doesn't say so directly, but the court has said, states, you can't violate free speech, you can't violate free exercise. Right? Whatever the Bill of Rights means, it restricts both the federal government and the state government equally. But that was only the rule after the Civil War. The Civil War told us that the states cannot be trusted to their own devices. But before the Civil War, we did not have that rule. The First Amendment did not limit state power. Okay. Now, the First Amendment, I think, is an easy one because it specifically says Congress should make no law, right? It's obvious that the First Amendment only applies to Congress. That's an easy one. Kevin, are you here?
Yes, Professor.
Well, Kevin, the First Amendment's obvious. But let's go down to the next line to the Fifth Amendment. And this is what's called the Takings Clause. Can you just read it for me?
The Fifth Amendment, no person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a...
Okay, just read the last part where it says, nor shall private property.
Okay. No shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation.
Okay, very good, Kevin. That's called the Takings Clause. Does the takings clause, Kevin, clarify whether it restricts the federal government's power or if it restricts the state's power?
It does not specifically.
So how do we know if this provision of the Fifth Amendment in the Bill of Rights restricts state power? How do we know?
Well, I don't know if you don't want me to get ahead, but.
Go for it. Go for it. Get ahead.
The Supreme Court talks about it and decides that the Bill of Rights were meant to limit the federal government.
Perfect. Exactly right. Thank you, Kevin. Okay. So for the first, 20 years of the Republic, it wasn't entirely clear whether the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments, restricts state power. And just let me a brief note. This phrase Bill of Rights didn't come about till much later. And depending on who you ask, it probably came around the 20th century. They were just called the amendments. So I don't like using the phrase Bill of Rights because that wasn't what they were called back then, but I'll use a phrase because that's what people know them as, the Bill of Rights. And my colleague Randy has a much bigger problem with this phrase than I do, but I'm happy to use it. All right, so we have this decision, 1833, Barron versus Baltimore. Here are the facts, right? This guy named John Barron had a wharf, which is basically a dock in Baltimore Harbor. The city did some construction work, which diverted water. And as a result, the water became too shallow near the dock. And he couldn't, run his business. So, you can't dock a boat if the water's too shallow. So Barron sued Maryland in court, arguing that they violated the Fifth Amendment. Now you're taking Property 2 this semester, you'll learn something called the Takings Clause. Or you take Property 2 next semester, this semester. You'll learn that there's a Takings Clause, which says that the government cannot take your property. I'm not concerned here with whether they actually took his property, although I think it's, it's significant that he thought that a regulation of land was a taking, but that's not important here. But the only question presented to the court was, did the Fifth Amendment limit state power? Did the Fifth Amendment control Maryland? Could a citizen sue Maryland for violating the Fifth Amendment? Sierra, are you here? Sierra? Gavin, you here, Gavin?
Yes, I am.
Gavin, thank you, sir. Walk me through Marshall's analysis. What does he hold here?
In this one, in this case, they ultimately hold that an individual cannot sue a state for infringing on his Fifth Amendment right. But that would later change in the future.
Well, you're right. So the holding is that the Fifth Amendment does not control state action. How does Marshall get there? What's his analysis look like?
Well, within the amendment itself, it contain no express language that create a limitation on the states. It's just interpreted to be a limitation on the federal government.
Right. So the Fifth Amendment is not like the First Amendment. There's no express language that says Congress only. So my question for you, Gavin, is how does Marshall reach that conclusion since the text is silent?
Well, because I guess the Bill of Rights, they were initially made to, settle down or please the anti-federalists, and that there wasn't many rights afforded to the states. They still feared the centralization of power within the federal government. So the Bill of Rights was originally made to keep or reserve that higher power within the states. So I guess within the legislative work, within the history or the intent of writing the Bill of Rights, it wasn't intended for the Bill of Rights and the rights that they were strained to apply to the states. It was just so.
Yeah, Gavin, I think you make a good point. You're saying that the framers didn't intend to put the states under this Bill of Rights. Let me state that point a little differently, Gavin. If the states had known that they were now subject to this federal constitution, would they have ratified the document? Would they have agreed to put themselves under this federal supervision?
Likely not.
Very good. Thank you, Gavin. I think Gavin made a good point, right? When you're dealing with these sort of constitutional arguments, the courts often say, well, what would the framers have intended, right? I think it's a credible argument that the framers would have never wanted to give, that the states would have never wanted to give the federal government this much power over them, that they want to have their own authority. Now, Vikesh, are you here?
Yes, sir.
Vikesh, let me ask you this question. If the protection of property was so important, what could Maryland do? Like, if Maryland thought protecting property was really important, what could Maryland do?
They added something in their own constitution.
Yes. Is it easier or harder to amend a state constitution or a federal constitution? Which is easier?
I would say it's easier to do the state constitution.
Why? Of course, is an obvious answer.
States have power over their own constitution.
And do they have to negotiate with 12 other states?
No, you don't. It's just your own state. You deal with your own business, I guess.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Vikesh. Marshall explains that if a state doesn't like some rule, they can easily amend their own constitution. Right? There's no requirement to persuade the other, actually there are more than 12 states now, there are 20 odd states at this point, to ratify. Amending the Constitution is not easy. You need 2/3 of both houses of Congress, and you need 3/4 of the states. But Maryland can amend their Constitution by a simple majority vote in some cases. Okay, so number one, the framers would not have intended to put the states under this new regime. Number two, if Maryland wants it, they can amend their own damn Constitution. The next argument I think is also quite good. Marshall argues that there are certain structural arguments. We mentioned earlier Article 1, Section 10. I think it was Erica who read it for us. Article 1, Section 10 lists all of the restrictions on the state power. That's it. And the fact that they listed these few items suggests there are no other restrictions, right? If all the restrictions appear in this itty-bitty section, Article 1, Section 10, the presumption is that the other provisions only limit federal power. Indeed, if you go to the class notes, you'll see Article 1, Section 9 right above it. And you'll see Article 1, Section 9 says, no bill of attainder or ex post facto law shall be passed. That's Congress. Congress can't pass a bill of attainder and ex post facto law. A bill of attainder is basically a statute that punishes someone, right? Rather than having a court convict you, a statute convicts you. An ex post facto law is where they change the law after the fact. So let's say you're driving 65 today, you're fine. Tomorrow they drop the speed limit to 55 and they send you a ticket. You can't do that. You can't change the law after the fact. What you'll see is that in Article 1, Section 9, there's an ex post facto clause. In Article 1, Section 10, there's also an ex post facto clause, right? There's different. When Congress wants to restrict the states, they use express language. When Congress wants to restrict the federal government, they use general language. And that's how the framers approached it. The presumption is that overregulations are a federal power, not state power. Okay. Questions on Barron v. Baltimore? If you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. None? Is it that good? It couldn't be possible. I'm not that clear. Well, let me try to explain a bit more, and I'll wrap things up if you're feeling so confident. Barron's one of my favorite opinions in the entire book. I think at every point Marshall gets it right. This is why I have to concede he's a brilliant judge. When he wants to be good, he's on fire. I mean, this is I think his logic here is unassailable. It's just every point is right. I think it's one of my favorite cases we have. But the upshot here is that the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments, did not limit state power. That would change after the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868, following the Civil War. Although the court wouldn't, the words incorporate means to extend. The court wouldn't extend the Bill of Rights to the states until well into the 20th century. Indeed, there's still some provisions of the Bill of Rights that have never been incorporated. So, for example, The federal Constitution protects the right of a grand jury indictment. That was not incorporated. The federal government, the federal Constitution guarantees a jury trial right. That's not been incorporated. And there are maybe one or two others, depending how you count, that have not been incorporated. Questions? All right, let me try to wrap up, summarize, and then I'll give you guys your minute paper. And actually, you can start typing the minute paper now if you like, but I'll summarize here for a bit. The thrust of our class so far has been these sort of foundational cases from the Marshall Court. We have Marbury, you have McCulloch v. Maryland, you have Gibbons, and you have Barron. And all these cases sort of define the powers of the new federal government. And invariably, all these cases sort of defended federal authority. Barron, not so much. Barron said the states have their own power as well. McCulloch was a critical case because it established this necessary and proper clause, what's often called the sweeping clause, which allows Congress to enact lots of laws that aren't expressly enumerated. And Gibbons adopted a very broad conception of commerce, although that meaning hasn't changed too much. And the court adopted a broad meaning of among, which I think allows Congress to regulate commerce that's within a state if it's some sort of spillover effect. But when you combine McCulloch and Gibbons over the next 100 years, the courts would broadly expand what Congress can do. And at every juncture, as Congress as Congress pushes further, for the most part, the courts blessed those expansions of federal power. Now, in class for Monday, we're going to move forward, right? We're going to move forward on class for Monday. We're going to start thinking about the enumerated powers more carefully. And we're going to move on from the Marshall Court to the Chase Court, which was before the Civil War. And then we move on to the early 20th century. And I think you're going to see how the court's broad reading from McCulloch and Gibbons empowered a far greater expansion of federal power. Okay, and I see people sending me chats. Please put them in the app rather than in the chat. That way I can see them later and improve them. Okay. Any other questions? No? All right, I'll be back.
Question 5 on your poll or minute question?
What?
I'm sorry, is question 5 on
No,
your
no,
poll?
there's no question. It's just go ahead and answer. Just type in whatever you want. The current question being polled now is, what's your takeaway from today's class? That's the question. Okay.
It's showing up as question 5, but
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Yeah.
I was just trying to make sure I'm typing it on the right thing.
Yep, that's it. You're good. Okay. Any other questions? All right. I'll see you all on Wednesday, and I'll be back here in about 10 minutes for office hours. Thank you.